It was supposed to be a routine police raid, nothing dramatic, no flashing sirens or neighbors gathering outside, just officers walking into a quiet house in Usalapur, Chhattisgarh. Following a tip about fake currency being printed inside, a small illegal operation involving paper, ink, and a printer running late into the night. But the moment the police stepped inside, something felt wrong. Because before they could even begin searching, a heavy, unsettling smell filled the air, the kind of smell that instantly tells you this place is hiding something far worse than counterfeit money. Officer S paused, exchanged silent looks, and instinctively covered their faces. As they moved further into the house, they noticed the absence of the wife, no movement, no signs of daily life. No clear answers from the husband, whose explanations kept changing, sounding rehearsed yet careless at the same time. And then one officer looked up toward the rooftop and noticed a water tank. An ordinary object that suddenly felt out of place. When they opened it, what they discovered transformed this investigation forever, because this was no longer about fake notes or a financial crime. This was about a marriage that had quietly collapsed, about suspicion, control, and a man who believed he could erase murder by hiding it in plain sight, because inside that water tank was the truth, waiting silently, decomposing with time, proving that some crimes don't come to light through confession, but through coincidence. And this story, as it unfolds tonight, is not just about what the police found, but about how a normal-looking life slowly turned into something terrifying, without screams, without witnesses, and without anyone noticing until it was far too late. The marriage, at least on the surface, looked ordinary, the kind that never attracts attention from neighbors or relatives. The husband appeared quiet, reserved, someone who kept to himself, while the wife was known to be more expressive, more present in daily routines. But behind closed doors, the relationship had been slowly decaying, not because of one single fight, but because of constant suspicion that never left the room. The husband was obsessed with control, with knowing where his wife went, who she spoke to, how long she stayed out. And over time, this suspicion turned into accusations. Arguments that never happened loudly enough for anyone outside to hear, but were sharp enough to leave emotional scars. Neighbors later recalled that they rarely saw the couple together. Meals were quiet, conversations short, and there was a growing distance that felt unnatural for a married pair. What no one knew at the time was that the husband was also involved in printing fake currency inside the house, an activity he believed was secret, risky, and fragile, and he was terrified that his wife might expose it, either intentionally or accidentally, and this fear mixed dangerously with his jealousy, creating a mental state where he began seeing her not as a partner, but as a threat, someone who could destroy everything he was trying to build. Police would later say that this combination of paranoia, illegal activity, and emotional instability is often what precedes domestic murders, because the mind starts justifying violence long before the act itself happens, and by the time anyone notices the silence inside the house, the damage has already begun. The day the murder happened did not begin with chaos or violence. It began like any other ordinary day, quiet, slow, almost forgettable. There were no screams reported, no neighbors calling the police, no sudden disturbance that would hint at what was about to unfold. Inside the house, the tension had already been building for weeks, and that day it finally reached a breaking point. According to the police investigation, another argument broke out between the couple, once again centered around suspicion and control. The husband accused his wife of things he could never prove, questioned her loyalty, her intentions, and most importantly, her silence about what he was doing inside the house. The argument did not explode outward. Instead, it collapsed inward, turning deadly. At some point, the husband lost control, and what followed was not a moment of blind rage, but a deliberate act. He strangled his wife until she stopped moving, until the room went completely silent. And in that silence, instead of panic or regret, his mind shifted into calculation, because he knew calling for help would end everything: the fake currency operation, his freedom, and the image he had carefully maintained. So rather than reporting the death, he chose concealment. The body remained inside the house for hours, possibly longer, while he planned his next steps, wiping surfaces, closing doors, thinking not like a grieving husband, but like someone trying to erase a problem. And that decision, made in those quiet hours after the killing, is what turned a domestic fight into a deeply disturbing crime that would only come to light by pure chance. What happened next was even more disturbing, because instead of distancing himself from the crime, the husband stayed in the house, living around the body, moving through rooms as if nothing irreversible had just happened. Investigators later believed that he waited deliberately, allowing time to pass so decomposition would make identification harder. And during this time, he began preparing for what he thought would be the perfect disappearance. He brought sharp tools into the house, Everyday items that would not raise suspicion if anyone noticed them later, and then, with a level of calm that shocked even seasoned officers, he dismembered his wife's body into multiple pieces, working slowly, methodically, not like someone panicking, but like someone executing a plan. Each piece was wrapped carefully in plastic, sealed with tape, as if order could somehow control the horror of what he had done, and when he was done, he looked for a place that felt invisible. Somewhere no one would think to check, a place already associated with water, noise, and routine maintenance, and that is how the rooftop water tank became part of this crime, because to him, it wasn't a hiding place, it was camouflage, something so ordinary that it blended into daily life, and as he lifted those wrapped pieces into the tank, he believed time and water would do the rest, that smell would be explained away, that absence would fade into normalcy, and that his wife, like so many overlooked victims, would simply vanish without questions. For days after that, life around the house continued in a way that felt disturbingly normal. The husband went about his routine, spoke to people when necessary, and acted as though nothing inside his world had collapsed. And when questions about his wife began to surface, he already had answers prepared. He told some people she had gone to visit relatives, told others she was unwell and resting elsewhere. And because this was not a household that attracted attention, no one pushed too hard. What made this period even darker was the fact that he had already sent the children away to stay with Emily before the murder, a move police later described as premeditated, because it ensured there would be no witnesses, no emotional pressure, and no sudden questions from inside the home. Meanwhile, the fake currency operation continued quietly, printers running, materials hidden in plain sight, and in his mind, as long as the illegal money kept moving and no one came knocking, the murder remained buried. But reality has a way of leaking through even the most controlled lies, because neighbors slowly began noticing the smell, faint at first, then impossible to ignore, something rotten that didn't match the explanations being given, and while no one imagined the truth, that smell became the first crack in a carefully constructed illusion, a silent signal that something inside that house was waiting to be discovered. That discovery did not come from suspicion of murder, it came from a completely different crime. When police finally arrived at the house, their focus was narrow and technical: counterfeit currency, illegal printing equipment, financial fraud, nothing more. Officers entered expecting to seize machines and paperwork, but the moment they stepped inside, the smell that neighbors had been quietly complaining about became impossible to ignore. It clung to the walls, lingered in closed rooms, and immediately told experienced officers that this was not just poor sanitation or waste, as they questioned. The husband, his body language began to shift. His answers were inconsistent, sometimes overly detailed, sometimes strangely vague, and when asked about his wife, he avoided eye contact, changed timelines, and repeated the same rehearsed lines, that she was away, that she would return soon. But the house itself contradicted him. There were signs of deep cleaning, water spills where they didn't belong, areas that looked recently scrubbed, and then one officer noticed the ladder leading to the rooftop, and the water tank above, an ordinary household structure that suddenly felt heavy with implication. When they climbed up and opened it, the truth finally surfaced, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that permanently altered everyone present, because inside that tank were tightly wrapped packages, submerged, decomposing, unmistakably human. And in that moment, the fake currency case disappeared entirely, replaced by the realization that they had just uncovered a murder that had been carefully hidden, patiently waiting for chance to bring it into the open. Once the contents of the water tank were brought out, the house stopped being a crime scene for fraud and became something far darker. Forensic teams were called in, the area was sealed, and piece by piece the reality became impossible to deny. The remains belonged to the missing wife, and the level of decomposition told investigators that this was not a recent act, but something that had been planned, executed, and lived with. As officers confronted the husband with the evidence, his calm began to crack. At first he denied everything, then he blamed circumstances, and finally, under sustained questioning, the story shifted into a confession that revealed more than he likely intended. He spoke about suspicion, about fear that his wife would expose his illegal activities, about feeling cornered inside his own life, and what shocked investigators was not just what he admitted to doing, but how he described it, without emotion, without visible guilt, as if he were narrating a problem he had solved rather than a life he had destroyed. Forensic analysis later confirmed signs of strangulation, deliberate dismemberment, and careful packaging, details that pointed to intent rather than impulse. As the case file grew thicker, officers began to realize that many warning signs had been present long before the murder: controlling behavior, isolation, secrecy, and a complete absence of intervention, all combining into a situation where violence became, in his mind, a solution. And by the time the truth surfaced, it was no longer just about one man's crime, but about how easily extreme darkness can exist behind ordinary walls without anyone noticing until it is too late. As the investigation expanded, details emerged that had never been part of the public narrative at the time, things that were either overlooked or quietly buried during the early reporting. Police learned that the husband had been researching methods of body disposal days before the murder, not openly, but through fragmented searches and conversations that only made sense in hindsight. There were also indications that the water tank had been partially cleaned before police arrived, suggesting he believed water and chemicals would erase evidence faster than they actually could. Neighbors later admitted that they had sensed something was wrong weeks earlier, a change in his behavior, curtains always drawn, lights on late into the night, and a nervous urgency whenever anyone came close to the house. Yet no one intervened, partly out of social distance, partly out of fear of being wrong, and partly because crimes like this rarely announce themselves. Investigators also discovered that the fake currency operation was smaller than initially believed, meaning the fear that drove him was not financial ruin alone, but exposure, humiliation, and loss of control, a psychological collapse that had been quietly progressing long before the murder. And when these elements were pieced together, the case stopped being just about a violent act and started looking like a slow descent, where every ignored red flag, every unasked question, and every moment of silence helped create the conditions for something irreversible, something that no police raid was ever meant to uncover, yet somehow did. By the time the case reached the courts, the story had already shifted from shock to reflection, because what stood out was not just the brutality of the murder, but how long it remained hidden in plain sight. Prosecutors built their case around intent, emphasizing that this was not a sudden loss of control, but a sequence of calculated decisions. From sending the children away, to killing, dismembering, and choosing a hiding place that blended into everyday life, the defense tried to frame it as emotional instability. But the evidence told a different story, one of planning, awareness, and sustained deception. Forensic timelines, tool marks, and the condition of the remains all reinforced that narrative, and as details were presented, the courtroom fell quiet in a way that felt heavier than outrage, because everyone realized how easily this could have gone undiscovered, if not for a completely unrelated crime. The fake currency raid that no one could have predicted, and outside the courtroom, conversations shifted toward uncomfortable questions about domestic control, isolation, and how often warning signs are dismissed because they don't look dramatic enough. This case became a rem. Dare that some of the most dangerous situations do not announce themselves with noise or chaos. They sit quietly behind closed doors, waiting for coincidence to expose them. And even then, the truth arrives too late to save the one person who needed it most. Even after the verdict, the case refused to fade quietly, because the more people learned about it, the more unsettling it became, not for its violence alone, but for how ordinary everything around it had seemed. The house was not abandoned immediately. The neighborhood returned to routine, and life moved forward in the same streets where something unthinkable had happened. And that contrast is what lingered, the realization that extreme cruelty does not always wear a frightening face. Sometimes it looks calm, organized, and invisible. Investigators later reflected that if the police had not seen for the counterfeit money, the body might have remained hidden for much longer, slowly dissolving into silence and excuses. The husband had counted on that, on time dulling curiosity, on society accepting absence without demanding answers, and in many ways he was almost right, because no missing person report was filed immediately, no urgent search launched, no alarm raised beyond quiet discomfort. And this part of the story forces an uncomfortable truth into focus, that systems often react only when something breaks loudly, while slow, controlled violence slips through unnoticed. This became less about one man's actions and more about the fragile gaps between neighbors, families, and institutions, gaps where people disappear not because no one cared, but because no one thought it was their place to ask. And long after the evidence was cataloged and the files were closed, that silence became the most haunting part of the entire story. And as this story comes to an end, what remains is not just the memory of a crime, but a quiet discomfort that stays with you long after the details fade. Because the Usalapur water tank murder was never loud, never chaotic. It didn't unfold in the streets or under flashing lights. It happened slowly, privately, in a place meant to be safe. And it reminds us how easily violence can hide behind routine, behind closed doors, behind explanations that sound reasonable enough not to question. This case teaches us that sometimes the most horrifying truths are uncovered by accident, not because someone was looking for them, but because fate intervened at the right moment. And if you're listening to this right now, lying awake or slowly drifting towards sleep, remember that every true crime story you hear is also a real human life that ended in silence. And if stories like this make you pause, make you think, or make you want to understand the darkness that can exist in ordinary places, then stay here, subscribe to this channel. Like this video so it reaches more listeners who find comfort in listening rather than watching, and explore the other stories on this channel, because there are more truths waiting to be told, and many more nights where stories like this quietly unfold, one voice, one listener, and one unsettling reality at a time.